Hello and welcome back to the channel. My name is Judy and I love travel, history, and finding out what makes people tick. You can learn an awful lot about a person by looking at their home. Were they rich or poor? How did they grow up? What kind of life did they lead? Today we're sailing into Split in modern Croatia to visit Roman Emperor Diocletian's retirement home. Emperor Diocletian was a nobody named Diocles who was born about 6 miles from here. He chose what so many in history who didn't have wealth or connections did. He joined the army, in this case, the Roman Imperial Army, and eventually rose to the level of emperor. Today's visit is going to be a history lesson on the hoof, but I'm just going to give you enough information here in the video blog so you'll understand what you're looking at. If you're curious and want to learn a great deal more about the man who bent the empire to his will and actually managed to live long enough to retire instead of being murdered, check out my WordPress blogs. I'll put the link in the description box below. For now, grab yourself a beverage, sit back and relax while we time travel to the year 295 AD, when construction on this marvel began, today on The Armchair Traveler. Split is a relatively small town located prettily on the shore of a sheltered harbor, backed up by mountains on the coast of modern-day Croatia. It's an easy one-day cruise from Venice, which is where my trip began. Croatia became independent most recently in 1995 after a brutal war to get themselves out from under Serbian control. I've been told it's considered extremely impolite to speak of that war, at least in this part of Croatia, but further south in Dubrovnik, the residents aren't at all shy about calling out the viciousness, brutality, and war crimes of their Serbian occupiers. Dubrovnik is the next stop on our cruise, so you'll learn a bit more about it then. Croatia as an independent country relies heavily on tourism. The current population of Split is a bit more than 160,000. The last data I found told me that 900,000 tourists visit annually. I visited on a beautiful day in early April. The weather was sunny and pleasant, hallmarks of the area, which is why it was developed, and the site was reasonably populated with tourists like me, most of whom arrived by ship. You probably know that Venice finds itself overwhelmed by tourists, particularly those arriving by ship, and has taken steps to make it difficult for cruises to start, end, or visit there. I think that eventually Split may have to make the same kind of decisions, but I'm happy it didn't happen before my visit. I visited former Yugoslavia back in the 1980s as part of a U.S. government delegation, when it was one country unwillingly glued together out of a group of very unhappy individual provinces. Under communism, Yugoslavia and any town along the Adriatic coast drew hundreds of thousands of sun-seeking tourists, not just from further inland, but also from those cold, gloomy, and less than fun-loving outposts of the former Soviet Union. Yugoslavia, which had the reputation for being somewhat more easygoing, drew them for the sunshine and the possibility of a nice vacation. The country put a premium on attracting tourists, one which independent Croatia has been wise to continue. When Emperor Diocletian cast his eye on it, he would have known the area quite well since he was born in the imperial capital of Salona, modern Solun, about 6 miles from here, and decided to build his combination retirement villa and fortress. There was no town, but people did live here. Work began on what we'll call his retirement villa, although it really was a fortress, in AD 295, 10 years before he voluntarily retired. History tells us that Diocletian suffered from gout and possibly arthritis. He had been a cavalry officer in his youth and doubtless took numerous falls, both in practicing, drilling, and in combat. Perhaps his bones ached. There are some wells near here with sulfur, and sulfur has always been a feature of spas. Diocletian primarily wanted someplace safe, though. He had been a soldier and he knew how to pick his ground, except perhaps for its isolation from the hotbeds and intrigues of the western imperial capital, then located in Milan, and the eastern capital in far-off Nicomedia. There was nothing here not to like. Diocletian didn't inherit his job. He was elected by a group of fed-up soldiers when his predecessor died, either by accident — the story they put out was he was struck by lightning — or more likely was murdered. Diocletian was a good soldier, but I think a better politician and administrator. He understood his limitations. You can read a lot more about him in my WordPress blog. I'll put the link in the description. As emperor, Diocletian took steps to guarantee that he could retire in safety and comfort. He had no intention of dying in office. His villa is laid out like a military camp, called a castrum, more or less square in shape, complete with sturdy walls, reinforced gates, plenty of guard and watchtowers, and 2 main streets that intersected in the middle. This was a large establishment. The grounds cover nearly 4 hectares, much of it which you can't see, close to 10 acres or more than 430,000 square feet. That would be 4 times the square footage of the U.S. Pentagon building in Northern Virginia. The harbor approach included a small landing with a gate. The buildings here were draped in marble and limestone covering over basic Roman-style construction, complete with locally mined stone, a lot of brick and Roman concrete. The emperor spared no expense. He imported marble from Italy and 12 sphinxes, 3 of which survive, from Egypt to decorate his villa. The palace area, it amounts to about half of Split's Old Town today, is still in use, filled with restaurants, bars, shops, and some residential housing. I've read that about 3,000 people live and work here on the site. I had a hard time since no map was provided, but I did find this labeled architectural guide to help me puzzle out what I was looking at. The artist's rendering of the villa and the architectural guide clearly show 4 entrances through fortified villa walls. The drawing I showed you initially indicates that there were 4 main entrances or gates, each with a different purpose, status, and design. What you're looking at here is the south or harbor gate. In antiquity, the palace abutted the harbor with a single landing and a fortified gateway. Modern tourists actually still enter from this direction, but the view has changed quite a bit. The area in front of the palace has been built up and a seawall added to support the fill. The new area in front, chock full of markets, vendors, and happy tourists, is called the Riva, and includes not just a welcome awning and shops, but an unfortunate car park with cars, buses, and pedestrians all jockeying for position. Our guide met us with a bus at the dock, but we easily could have walked. It's less than half a mile from where we landed. Traffic was moderate, but I imagine in high season it would be a pedestrian nightmare. Eventually, perhaps, the city will abolish the car park, banish the cars, and pedestrianize and landscape the entire area, turning it into a kind of harbor walk, but that change lies in the future. The Iron Gate gets its name from its association with iron weaponry and the soldiers who apparently entered the palace grounds here. The original illustration I showed you is a little unclear, but we can see men, perhaps with carts and supplies, walking along the pathway just outside the villa. Were they bringing in food for the retired emperor's court? Possibly. It could have been anything. This is the only gate, incidentally, that has been in continuous use to this day. At first, I didn't even recognize it as a gate from the interior. My eye was caught by the bell tower next to it. The area surrounding and disguising the gate is now called Cyprian's Palace and hosts the Church of Our Lady of the Bell Tower. The bell tower and the clock were repurposed from the original watchtowers, which stood guard on either side of the Iron Gate. The Golden or North Gate was originally the main ceremonial entrance to the villa. This is how Emperor Diocletian and his entourage is said to have entered the complex when he first moved in. The gate is on the road to the north toward Salona, the then capital of the Roman province of Dalmatia and his birthplace. Although he was retired, many visitors to Salona would have wanted to visit the emperor. Today, the 7th century church of St. Martin can be found above the gate and is open to the public. My photo gives you a better idea of the human scale of the area. Here we see the last of the 4 gates, the Silver or East Gate, which opened up on a road leading east out of the palace to the next town over, called Epithium in antiquity. To me, this one looks more like a monumental gateway, but that's just because you can see the remaining arcades above it. It wasn't considered as important as either the Golden Gate or the Iron Gate. It's less ornate, but it still has 2 niches which house sculptures now long vanished. Like the Golden Gate, the Silver Gate was located between 2 towers, and besides them, there were 4 more towers that oversaw the eastern gateway to the palace. Roman imperial construction survives today because it was incredibly sturdy and put together in multiple layers built to last. People could and did remove sections, sometimes just the facings, and sometimes a great deal more. The Roman Colosseum in Rome is a prime example, and the building literally refused to collapse. The Romans built of carefully cut and fit stone, normally with a great deal of locally produced narrow bricks and incredibly tough and flexible Roman concrete, which in some cases has actually outlived the stone it surrounded. You might think that Roman builders had it tougher than modern builders because they didn't have computers to help them, and in a way you'd be correct. They had to do all their design and construction based on personal experience. The flip side is they didn't have a computer to tell them how they could cut corners and get away with it and still have the building stand. As a result, Roman architecture is seriously overbuilt. The base of these buildings was made of locally cut stone, carefully put together, bricks, and Roman concrete. The facings were things like local stone, somewhat prettier, limestone, marble, or granite. These two photographs are part of the palace cellars, which were built under Diocletian's living quarters. The cellars were large, and the foundations of the palace are fascinating. We visited the cellars on the way into the palace in order to get our tickets, and for a stop, perhaps, to patronize the local salespeople and buskers. There was also an art exhibition which provided some additional things to look at. Notice where the decorative top coating has fallen away at the top of these pillars, and you can see the typical Roman-style brick and concrete underneath. Welcome to the beating heart of this villa, Diocletian's peristyle. This was the functional and ceremonial center of this fortress home. Roman construction was tough, adaptable to local conditions and building materials. The Romans were flexible and paid close attention to building safe and sanitary areas with clean water, a way to dispose of waste, and what we'd call amenities. The archaeological drawing shows us baths and latrines throughout the villa, although none were on display when I visited. There must have been furnaces and an underground heating system called a hypocaust as well, although I couldn't find that either. The peristyle is grand and spacious and was clearly meant to impress. The arched opening between the pillars in the background led to the retired emperor's quarters. I rather enjoyed the fact that some young people, whether college students or actors I couldn't tell, were roaming about dressed in what they thought was full Roman kit. One hint perhaps remains of the careful water and sanitation management that was the Romans' hallmark, although it wasn't marked, and I admit I'm guessing. A drainage system here under the peristyle. Notice the drain covers in this photograph. There's slightly darker gray stone on the surface. They may or may not be original, but something like them must have existed in Diocletian's time. What I have no idea is whether they drained to the harbor or perhaps to water storage cisterns that have yet to be uncovered. The gateway at the far end of the peristyle led to Diocletian's personal quarters, which seem to have extended to the left or the west side of the palace. While we don't have a description of what they might have looked like, we can make a guess. It was luxurious in the extreme by Roman standards, which were quite different from ours. There were likely marble-faced walls inlaid with gold mosaics and plenty of statues. It might not have been very comfortable by our standards. The rooms where Romans slept were small, dark, and often windowless, and while perhaps lavishly decorated with frescoes and mosaics, sported the most Spartan of bedding. I think this might have suited Diocletian well. He might have been a retired emperor, but he spent most of his life as a soldier in similar surroundings. A series of interconnecting chambers led from the peristyle to the emperor's bedroom. What you see here is the vestibule, now called the rotunda because of its shape. It's circular, and as you can see, included a dome. This was a gathering and meeting hall for selected audiences, such as ambassadors. It must have been lavishly decorated with statues in the still visible semicircular niches, and perhaps faced with marble and boasting an inlaid floor. All of that is gone now, but this was an important room and not an afterthought. It was designed to remind the visitors, as was everything else in the villa, of just how important their host had been. One feature of the room does deserve mention. Although whatever decorated the space was long gone, the architectural design remains. The room has excellent acoustics. I'm told that they present concerts here in the summertime, although not when I visited. The story goes that the emperor would wait patiently nearby so he could overhear what his visitors, who were none the wiser, were actually saying about him. Roman emperors were by no means the first nor the last to build lasting monuments to themselves in the form of mausoleums. They built them to symbolize their immortality, and I suspect in the profound hope that after death they would somehow be elevated to a position where they would be spared the torments of hell. We may think differently today, but it's fair to assume they believed this was the natural order of things. It might seem a little creepy, but these buildings were meant to be admired while the builder was still alive. They symbolize the power of the future resident in the here and now, as well as in the future. Diocletian's tomb was an 8-sided building sited at one end of the peristyle, where it would have been seen and admired by his visitors. It was surrounded by an elaborate colonnade, complete with elaborately decorated Corinthian columns, which survive to this day. This was a sturdy building, and one that could be repurposed. The mausoleum and much of the palace actually owe their survival to the fact this area was converted into a Christian church, housing the remains of one San Domnius. Domnius was a bishop in Split around the year 300, or while Diocletian was still alive and before he moved in. He is venerated as the patron saint of Salona to this day. He was a victim of what's called Diocletian's great persecutions and was beheaded in 304 AD near here. While the building was repurposed and survived intact, I suppose the church officials decided it might be a wise idea to disguise the original nature of it a bit, which is what they did with a new entryway and an ornate bell tower. The mausoleum was intended to be viewed directly from the peristyle and admired while the emperor was still alive. Today that view has been obscured by a bell tower, with part of the original colonnade incorporated into the design. The bell tower is much later than the conversion of the mausoleum into a church. It dates from about 1100 and was put together in Romanesque style. Unfortunately, it was rebuilt in 1908 and lost most of its sculptures and decorations, but even in its present state shows us a little bit about the style. Although heavily disguised, some remnants of the original decorations remain. Diocletian had access to an enormous empire's worth of decorative art and wasn't shy about appropriating whatever tickled his fancy to decorate this building project. This Sphinx is one of 12 that he brought here from Egypt, which by this time was a Roman province, no longer an independent country. The symbolism of the Sphinx extends beyond imperial decoration or domination of the province. The emperor used them to connect his residents and himself with the glory and mystique of ancient Rome. Although the bell tower might have obscured the shape of the mausoleum from the exterior, I had to walk around the side to get a good look at it. A view of the interior gives the game away. It's highly decorated, partially with some of the original material. The inside is circular. It has columns, capitals, and niches. What you see today is gorgeous. The 8 red granite columns you see are original to the building. Diocletian led a spectacular life, rising from a Greek nobody in the provinces to a soldier, a cavalry commander, an emperor, and a retiree. He sited the Temple of Jupiter quite close to his private apartments, just across the peristyle from the mausoleum. It's easily identifiable in this aerial view because of the barrel-vaulted roof, a specialty of Roman construction. Diocletian associated himself with Jupiter via his original inheritance from Zeus. As emperor, he was Pontifex Max, which sounds like a mostly religious job, but is essentially political in nature. That job required him to support the panoply of gods the Romans worshipped, get non-believers to subscribe to them, often by converting existing gods with specific attributes to the Roman equivalent, and putting down anyone who refused to go along with it. It's safe to think that Diocletian took the task seriously, and this obligation probably motivated his persecution of the Christians, who would not bend to his will on the matter. I have seen sources that suggested that Diocletian's wife, her name was Prisca, and a daughter named Valeria were interested in religion and may have converted to Christianity, but I haven't seen any good evidence for those conversions, and there is no evidence at all that Diocletian himself converted or was interested. Diocletian's Temple of Jupiter was how he made his religious mark. The building was richly decorated on the outside, as you can see from the lintel and the surround of the doors, and the still surviving decorative elements in the pediment, complete with the same kind of Corinthian-topped columns we saw in the colonnade. This was a large building featuring a 6-column portico at one end and an open entryway. Along the frieze running under the barrel vault, there would have been carvings of various gods and other entities. The temple survived because it was converted into a baptistry during late antiquity, and in the Middle Ages was dedicated to John the Baptist. Most of the original decorations, except those carved in stone, have disappeared. Today, however, the interior is decorated with a bronze statue of John the Baptist. Diocletian died of natural causes in AD 312 and was interred in his mausoleum. It was never deified, as far as I can tell, an act that would have required approval by the imperial senate. By his date, that idea was actually going out of style. Most likely, however, he was worshipped as a god by the members of his personal court, at least while he was still alive, although the idea apparently didn't spread much outside his villa. Although never a god, his memory does live on in the form of this glorious retirement villa. This, however, might have been the least of the man's accomplishments. He introduced enormous bureaucratic and administrative reforms to the empire. He reorganized it into an eastern and western half, to make it possible for men to actually govern the area when news moved at the speed of a horse. He designed and implemented economic policies and tax reforms which were intended to stabilize prices. He also reorganized the military, remember he had been a soldier, to make it larger and more efficient. He also managed to survive long enough to retire in peace. The empire survived for another 160 years after his death, soldiering on until the fall of the Western Roman Empire in AD 476. Today we call what followed, a 500-year or so long period, the Middle Ages, although earlier students always called this the Dark Ages, in part because so many of the things accomplished by the empire either disappeared or were forgotten. The people living in those years most likely didn't see it that way at all. Like the empire, what followed had its own developmental path. This was a period of cultural, economic, and technological developments. Some of them were mostly the reacquisition of things people once knew and forgot, but many others were new. I hope you enjoyed your visit with me to Split and Diocletian's villa and learning a bit about the man and his times. Come back next time for another adventure with me here on The Armchair Traveler.